I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after what some are calling a triumphant Nato summit in The Hague, we assess the pledges made, before doing deeper dives into Ukraine's military and strategic innovations, and the threat posed by Russia on Europe's eastern flank, with dispatches from Lithuania and Latvia.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 26th of June, 3 years and 123 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's chief foreign affairs commentator David Blair, dialing in from The Hague, and our senior foreign correspondent, Roland Oliphant, who interviews the Latvian Minister of Foreign Affairs. But first, I summarise the latest military and political developments of the past 24 hours. Before we turn to the outcome of the NATO summit, let's assess the military developments of the past 24 hours. After what has been one of the worst months of the entire conflict in the aerial war, just in terms of the scale of civilian losses, last night was the quietest of June, with reports of only 41 drones launched by Russia and no missiles. Several UAVs made it through in frontline areas, but there are no reported casualties yet. The most significant air attack of the past 2 days was actually Ukrainian, a key military-industrial site in the Russian city of Taganrog, linked to Moscow's production of combat drones and electronic warfare systems, was damaged. We just don't yet know the scale of the disruption wrought by that attack. In the ground war, according to the ISW and others, there are still pockets of fighting in Kursk Oblast, as Russia elsewhere seeks to continue its offensive operations in northern Sumy. That sector where the head of the Ukrainian armed forces, Syrsky, now claims to have halted completely the Russian spring offensive. If that is true, that would mark a significant achievement indeed. The scale of Moscow's losses there are massive, with very little to show for it. And at some point, we'll need to do a deep dive into the battles that have taken place there to try and condense our reporting of the last few weeks. Elsewhere, geolocated footage of the last 3 days indicates Russian forces recently made minimal advances in northern and northwestern Volchansk, northeast of Kharkiv city. Yet, continuing a pattern of the past few weeks, the Ukrainians are pushing back in several places there, reportedly recently advancing around Borova in the same oblast. Down in Donetsk, Russian forces continue operations in the Seversk direction, but didn't make advances. There appears to have been some movement in that key sector of Pokrovsk, with movement north of Shevchenko-Pershi, just northeast of the city, and in western Lvivskaya to the northeast. Ukrainian forces reportedly advanced north of Lyman on Tuesday, with unconfirmed claims the Ukrainian brigade operating in that direction launched a successful counterattack against elements of the Russian 283rd Motorized Rifle Regiment and destroyed a platoon. On the southern axis, the ISW assessed that Russian forces continue limited ground attacks east near Malnivka, but did not advance, and likewise in western Zaporizhia. So, not masses to report in terms of direct action in the military realm, although I would point listeners to an interesting interview conducted by friend of the podcast, Professor Phillips O'Brien, with Andriy Zagorodnyuk, the defence minister of Ukraine, for a year before the full-scale invasion. He now runs one of the best Ukrainian security think tanks, the Centre for Defence Strategies. That's one we've cited several times on the podcast in the past. Now, Zagorodnyuk recently wrote an interesting paper advocating for what he called strategic neutralization, and I'll quote briefly from that now. If Ukraine's theory of victory rests not on the war ending, but on functionally defeating Russia's objectives while building a resilient, secure and sovereign state, then a new strategic framework is required. That approach would be designed to make Russian aggression across all domains operationally incapable of disrupting key aspects of Ukrainian strategic, political, economic and social life. It is not premised on compelling Russia to negotiate or exhausting its resources through attrition alone. Instead, it aims to paralyse Russia's ability to achieve any military success, not by defeating it in full, but by making the pursuit of its goals unworkable and futile in practice. The strategy recognises that functional defeat, where a military capability is not completely destroyed but rendered irrelevant, is both a repeatable and scalable outcome that Ukraine has already achieved in multiple cases. Now, in his interview with Phil, he said several interesting things, including, where the Russians have made some of their small advances, we generally believe it was down to finding a place where we did not have enough drones. As we scale up UAV production, this will hopefully happen less and less. Another quote, there are certain capabilities such as Patriots, parts for Bradley AFVs and artillery barrels that we can only get from the USA. So we need to keep a positive dialogue going with them to try and unlock such supplies. Just hold that thought, folks. But this is the bit I found most interesting, especially in terms of our deep dives, no pun intended, into the Black Sea, of which you'll hear more next week. He says this, I think we can look at the course of the war on the Black Sea to have an idea of how strategic neutralisation as a strategy works. In the naval war, we used new technologies to fight a very effective asymmetric war against the Russian fleet, driving it back to port and making it clear that the surface ships could not undertake the roles that they were intended to do. Operation Spiderweb is another example of how we need to use technological and strategic methods to cause very expensive and advanced parts of the Russian military to fail in their ability to undertake its missions. If we can do this, we can at the same time start building up the institutions of our state and economy while under Russian threat. This has happened with other states, such as Israel. In the 1960s and 70s, they had to build up the infrastructure of their state under the constant possibility of war, confronted by states that were much larger, which they could not conquer, and which at least partly seemed set on their destruction. Israel instituted a strategy that made sure these states failed. So a very interesting interview, which we will link to in the show notes. On drones specifically, another interesting piece of intelligence recently is that Russian military bloggers are apparently commenting on the significant impact of Robert Blovdi, known by his call sign Magyar, as head of the Unmanned Systems Forces of Ukraine. I remember we reported at the time when he was allocated that position. Now, apparently, his strategy is embedding fixed UAV detachments along every stretch of the front line, staffed by drone pilots deeply familiar with their designated zone, rather than relying on roving reserve forces deployed reactively to emerging threats as previously. This establishes an unbroken kill corridor spanning the front, not anchored in traditional defences like trenches or troop numbers, but driven by FPV drone warfare, something, of course, we've reported on many times. But central to this model, he argues, and this is the innovation, first is to achieve aerial dominance, neutralising the Russian drone systems, stripping them of surveillance and strike capacity, and prioritising the elimination of the drone operators. So according to Russian accounts, Magyar has now been given expanded operational scope to do just that, accessing a broader arsenal, including authority to call in HIMARS missile fire. The sources report a reduction in strikes on Russian supply lines and rear echelons, attributing to it the Ukrainian pivot towards hunting down enemy UAV teams. So, interesting, further signs of Ukrainian adaptation. And that's before we even get into unmanned drone systems, as we saw in Operation Spider's Web. But let's turn to the political theatre next, theatre being the appropriate word, I think, and pick up where we left off yesterday at the NATO summit in The Hague. The top-line story is that NATO leaders have agreed to ramp up defence spending to 5% of their country's economic output by 2035, following months, one might even say years, of pressure from Donald Trump. The US president described that decision after our broadcast as a big win for Europe and Western civilization. Members said in a joint statement that they were united against profound security challenges, singling out the long-term threat posed by Russia and terrorism, reaffirming their, quote, ironclad commitment to the principle that an attack on one NATO member would lead to a response from the full alliance. However, the statement didn't include a condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine as it had a year ago. In the press conference afterwards, a visibly buoyant Trump said this: "I watched the heads of these countries get up, and the love and the passion that they showed for their countries was unbelievable. I've never seen anything quite like it. They want to protect their countries, and they need the United States. And without the United States, it's not going to be the same. It was really moving to see it. It was great, and I left here differently. I left here saying that these people really love their countries. It's not a rip-off, and we're here to help them protect their countries. They were so respectful of me." There was also this extraordinary encounter between a Ukrainian journalist for the BBC and the president.
Where are you from?
I'm from Ukraine.
Oh,
so my
wow.
question to you is whether or not the US is ready to sell anti-air missile systems Patriot to Ukraine. We know that Russia has been pounding Ukraine really heavily right now.
Are you living yourself now in Ukraine?
My husband is there.
Wow.
And
I can see you very, it's amazing.
And me with the kids, I'm in Warsaw actually, because he wanted me to be.
Is your husband a soldier? No?
He's
there now?
Yeah.
Wow. That's rough stuff, right? That's tough. And you're living here?
In Warsaw.
And you're a reporter?
I am.
Good. So let me just tell you, they do want to have the missiles, okay, as they call them, the Patriots. And we're going to see if we can make some available, They're very hard to get. We need them too. We were supplying them to Israel, and they're very effective, 100% effective. Hard to believe how effective. And they do want that more than any other thing, as you probably know. That's a very good question, and I wish you a lot of luck. I mean, I can see it's very upsetting to you. So say hello to your husband, okay? Thank you.
Before we get into the ramifications for Ukraine specifically, though, it is worth saying that for many, Rutte's strategy of playing up to Trump's ego was a masterpiece of diplomacy, keeping the US on board and reaffirming the solidity of a five, at least on paper. Trump was clearly delighted to be referred to as Daddy by Rutte, with the White House playing up to it by posting a video headlined Daddy's Home. At the very least, Rutte has bought time for Europe to more adequately prepare for a world where the US's attention is fixed in the Pacific and the Middle East. But that's where the critics of this approach take issue with this prioritising of the US over Europe's own capability development. They claim that Trump is fundamentally changeable and that none of these commitments really mean much long term, especially after, say, a phone call with Vladimir Putin. They also underscore how the 5% of GDP is, to a certain degree, a bit of creative accounting. And that's something, of course, Dom talked about in detail earlier in the week. For what it's worth, such is the depletion of European capacity. I don't think Rutte had much of a choice. And in that sense, he has achieved something truly important relative to what could have been possible in an alternative reality, with the US accelerating its withdrawal. But it will be for history to judge whether that came at the expense of European urgency to arm. We are still in a world dependent on the whim of the US president, after all. And this summit has done little to change that. It could even one day, who knows, be judged as a miscalculation, as Europe is breathing a sigh of relief rather than a sharp intake of breath. Now, on Ukraine, as Dom mentioned, one of the critical questions is whether Trump would be willing to sell Ukraine Patriot missile defense systems. That answer to the Ukrainian journalist will reassure some that he is. His 50-minute meeting with President Zelensky also apparently went well. He couldn't have been nicer, Trump said. We're going to see if we can make some Patriots available. We will also see what happens about money for Ukraine. Putin is misguided. It is possible he is an enemy. Trump also said in the press conference it's possible Putin has territorial ambitions beyond Ukraine. So lots of people are saying there were positive vibes from the summit, and yet at the same time I can't help but return to what was happening elsewhere, and these remarks by the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who confirmed that Trump will resist European pressure to escalate sanctions on Russia, arguing that doing so would close the door to potential peace negotiations with Moscow. He said, "If we did what everybody here wants us to do, and that is come in and crush them with more sanctions, we probably lose our ability to talk to them about the ceasefire. And then who's talking to them? Our sense of it is that the Russians are going to try to achieve on the battlefield what they've demanded at the negotiating table, which is certain territories, administrative lines and the like. We think it's going to be a lot harder for them to achieve that than they think it's going to be." So ultimately, for all of the talk, the rhetoric and the vibes, no major shift on the US applying pressure on Russia, which many believe is essential to make those very same peace talks he was talking about possible. Now let's stick with the subject of European defence capabilities next. On Monday's episode, you'll have heard Venetia's dispatch from the military exercises in Gotland, Sweden. And later in this episode, you'll hear Roland Oliphant's interview with Latvia's Minister of Foreign Affairs. But I want to turn now to David Blair, who's just returned from Lithuania, producing a long read about the new proverbial Iron Curtain on Europe's eastern flank, one soon to be made up by millions of landmines. David, welcome. Before we turn to that story, I have to ask you about your time at The Hague covering the NATO summit for the Telegraph. You've just written the following. Just as the Congress of Vienna of 1814-1815 was arranged around glittering balls and concerts, with a symphony conducted by Beethoven himself and the British delegation alone getting through 10,000 bottles of wine, so this summit in The Hague was designed to serve one purpose and one purpose alone: satisfying Mr. Trump's wants, needs and wishes. What's your sense of the mood there on that score, David?
Well, Donald Trump is going home a happy man. We know that because he told us. He enjoyed very much his night at the Dutch version of Buckingham Palace. He adored the King and Queen of the Netherlands. He bestowed on them his highest accolade. He described them as being straight from central casting. And he even got on pretty well with all the other NATO leaders. And then he declared, and these were perhaps for Donald Trump seminal words, he declared, referring to NATO, "It's not a ripoff." And then he said, "We're here to help." So the Allies seem to have got Donald Trump not just to stay in the alliance, but to sign a statement which explicitly contains the phrases ironclad commitment to Article 5. But there is a sting in the tail. And the sting in the tail is a very brief communique of 423 words, which does not condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The only reference to Ukraine is one sentence in paragraph 3, which says that allies will carry on supporting Ukraine, but it does not say why that support is necessary. So pleasing Donald Trump, which they seem to have successfully done, comes at a price.
Indeed. And what's your assessment of Rutte's strategy?
I think it's been vindicated by success. Trump is going home a happy man. He has now signed up explicitly to Article 5 in a summit declaration. And verbally as well, he's made it clear that he does support Article 5. And the Europeans have all now agreed that they will raise their core defense spending to 3.5%. And then when you add in associated infrastructure and so on, taking that up to 5%. Those are two very good outcomes. And quite frankly, a bit of calculated subservience along the way to get those outcomes is perfectly understandable. But as I mentioned, on Ukraine, Trump is still where he was before the summit began.
Thanks, David. To the subject at hand, then, we've reported previously on several NATO countries ripping up the Ottawa Convention, which was the agreement signed at the end of the Cold War to ban the use of landmines on European soil and beyond. The pages of history had turned, as it were, and yet that's not the case today, is it?
You know, I'm old enough to remember Princess Diana joining the global campaign to eradicate landmines, Tony Blair in his fourth week as Prime Minister back in 1997 banning the production and export of landmines, then the Ottawa Convention signed by 164 countries, which prohibits the manufacture, stockpiling and deployment of landmines. Every single European Union member state signed up to that convention. And now, suddenly, you have 5 countries, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland, which will all, by the end of this month, have given formal notice of their withdrawal from the Ottawa Convention, which will allow them to make, stockpile and deploy landmines probably from the end of this year onwards. And they're doing this out of simple necessity. They judge that landmines are essential to the defense of their countries because of the threat from Russia. And meanwhile, is the British government going to criticise its allies for withdrawing from the Ottawa Convention, which was once so important? Of course it won't. The British government will be completely understanding of this move. So I'm afraid it's a symbol of the new Europe, the return of the landmine.
And you went to Lithuania to see the new defences being built there.
Yes, I went to what you might call a parrot's beak of Lithuanian territory, which juts into Belarus. And no village in this little salient is more than a couple of miles or a few miles from the border with Belarus on 3 sides. And I went to a hamlet at the very tip of the parrot's beak, just literally a stone's throw from the border. And there, gashing its way through the forest, is a very formidable silver fence buttressed with coils of barbed wire, and perhaps one day with landmines as well.
You also registered the mood among officials and the people who live in that vicinity. Would you say that there is extreme concern in terms of the likelihood of there potentially one day being a Russian incursion?
Well, I met a stone's throw from the border fence. I met a lady who was born in 1941, the year of Operation Barbarossa, of course. And her first memory is of the retreating Germans burning down that hamlet in 1944. And now she contemplates the prospect of another war with horror, not for herself, but for her grandchildren and for her 2 great-grandchildren. And she doesn't like the idea of landmines being planted near her front door one bit, as you can imagine. But more broadly in Lithuania, I was very struck by the fact that last month, the Lithuanian parliament voted to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention by 107 votes in favour and 0 against, with 3 abstentions. And that just reflects the fact that, as you know, Francis, for all the Baltic states, the Russian threat is a reality. They live with it every day. And they believe that they have to prepare for the worst as the only possible way of deterring it and preventing it from happening. And now they judge that landmines are part of those preparations.
And since we're on this subject, David, we've spoken on the podcast many times about the Suwalki Gap and that stretch of land which, if Russia were to invade via Belarus, would cut off Poland to the south and Lithuania to the north as those forces drove towards Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave. And that, of course, would be extremely damaging for countries to the north in terms of them being able to defend themselves and get resupply from other NATO countries. Is that a scenario being actively prepared for?
Yes, Lithuania is preparing to defend itself really on 2 fronts, because they've got Kaliningrad on the western side of the country and Belarus on the east. So they're the only Baltic state which has to guard 2 hostile frontiers. And those frontiers are actually longer than you might think. There's 450 miles in total. And I spoke to the former defense minister who had first come up with the plan that involves landmines. And he says that if you're going to defend those frontiers and you're going to limit your enemy's options and slow them down and impede any advance that they might try and make, then you need to have anti-tank, anti-personnel, and anti-transport mines all together, along with plenty of other defenses as well, of course, physical barriers, dragon's teeth, drones, and all the rest of it. But you need a whole system of defense, and that is exactly what Lithuania is now engaged in building.
Well, David, always a pleasure. And as I say, we'll link to your piece in the show notes. It's a really fascinating read, including, as you say, testimony from people who live in the area, military figures, political figures who are working on this. And it also has lots of maps and diagrams, so you'll be able to visualize these places we were just speaking about. Before you go, David, was there anything that jumped out at you as you were reporting on this story? Of course, you spent an extensive amount of time in number 10 Downing Street. You would have had lots of briefing notes on these issues, no doubt, as well as from your time as a journalist before and since. But I just wonder, was there anything that you weren't previously familiar with from those briefing notes and articles over the years?
Yes, I was taken on a very interesting tour of Lithuania's parliament in Vilnius. And in my ignorance, I had thought that the dissolution of the Soviet Union back in 1991 was relatively peaceful, and that nice man Mikhail Gorbachev just allowed it to happen. But of course in Vilnius, that's not true at all. Gorbachev sent Soviet tanks in the dying days of the Soviet Union into Vilnius to the TV station to crush the country's bid for freedom. And they killed 14 innocent people. And today, the portraits of those 14 have a very prominent place displayed in the corridors of Parliament. And I was very struck by that, because that was an incident which, if I had ever known about it, it had slipped my mind in a fit of ignorance. And it's worth remembering that these are countries which value their independence and will not wish to relinquish it for any price. And having suffered so grievously in the past, they will do whatever they need to do to defend themselves.
David Blair, thank you very much. Now, over to Roland Oliphant and his conversation with Baiba Braže, Latvia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, who also held the post of Assistant Secretary General of NATO. Their conversation covers many of the issues that we've been talking about this week.
Baiba, I really wanted to talk to you about all the issues that, of course, Latvia as a Baltic state faces. I was intending to talk a lot about defence spending, about Russia, about Ukraine, all of that. But we've kind of been overtaken this week. I know it's a long way from Riga, but you must be watching what's happening between Israel and Iran. What does that mean for the security of Europe? Are there concerns for you there as you watch that unfolding?
I think there are several angles. Obviously, there is a direct interest both from Latvia, but also from wider European interests. And one is that we do fully agree with the point that Iran should not gain nuclear weapons. In that perspective, quite understandably, that there are different stages, to how do we get to that outcome. Not necessarily we agree that bombing is the best way to that. We much preferred the diplomatic way, which was, through JCPOA, through verification, through transparency measures, and so on and so forth. But we also fully accept that Iran was not cooperating fully, and there was a lot of indication that things were not going the right way. And the last was the board of directors of the IAEA, which came out with pretty strong statement on Iran's non-compliance de facto with its commitments. The proliferation risk is huge. That is another aspect that deeply worries us. We know that countries in the region, in the Middle East, are looking at that situation. The domino effect, if Iran had gained the nuclear, and then that would be something where proliferation is quite likely. Various indications, let's put it that way, and conversations, that would be a totally new situation in the Gulf and beyond. Another angle is, of course, the whole situation in the Middle East itself with regard to various tensions that we are seeing with regard to the enablement by Iran of Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, which then have brought various other developments. So remember 7 October, Hamas attack on Israel. Nowadays, we tend to forget that that was the source of the reason of the whole upheaval. Then, of course, the whole humanitarian situation in Gaza. So again, while understanding Israel's right to defend herself, it doesn't mean that international humanitarian law doesn't apply and that killing civilians or children and denying food or denying medicine is something that can be understood or supported. So there are various aspects, when we look at the situation and analyze that we take into account. Obviously, ideally, Iran would clearly say that it will fully cooperate and open up its facilities to IAEA and others, and there would be a transparency and guarantee that it is in compliance with its commitments under the IAEA and NPT and so on and so forth. So there's quite a bit of concern. Also, we have seen direct effects on the oil price. We have seen Iran enabling Russia's war in Ukraine. The transfer of Shahed, the transfer of Shahed technologies, enablement of all that. That has a direct consequence for the whole Euro-Atlantic security. The oil price rise gives income to Russia's budget and its ability to finance war in Ukraine. So there's all the aspects, all the interconnections are right there.
So even if you're sitting, in Riga on the Baltic, a very long way from Tehran, this is something you have to keep an eye on. Well, let's talk about NATO, if we may. The big thing that was on the table was about funding. Right. So there was this push for a 3.5% commitment. The Americans want 5%. I want to ask you, Latvia is already at 3.4% of GDP on defense. You and your neighbors are already edging towards the kind of 5% mark. How important is this whole debate around numbers and GDP from your perspective for the securing of the eastern flank?
It's important for the whole Euro-Atlantic security because both the joint threat assessment by NATO countries and our intel and other agencies, but also what we have said in NATO strategic concepts is basically straightforward, that Russia is the main and direct threat to the Euro-Atlantic security and allies' security. Terrorism is the most direct asymmetric threat to the citizens of the alliance. So with regard to Russia, so that is a state-level threat, and its war in Ukraine is showing very clearly that it's not intending to stop. Russia's policy is war. We are assessing on a regular basis the indicators within Russia, and everything is geared towards war. There is no change. There is no effort at peace at all. And that's on the economy. So almost half of Russia's budget is going directly to the war. The income from oil and gas is financing war. It's about a third in the federal budget. Political system is such that it's a so-called power vertical, which is directly dependent from the butchering Kremlin. There is no internal sort of dissent or lively opposition or any democratic sort of movements that could raise any different opinions. So pretty straightforward pro-war policy by all political actors within Russia. The military, I already explained, its war budget, everything is geared towards supplying the war and cannibalizing the economy, the rest of economy, to enable war. There is no free media in Russia, so there is no sort of opportunity to discuss disagreements in that respect. We also are seeing that, for example, in religions, that the Orthodox Church of Russia is fully aligned and pro-war, private sector fully aligned pro-war, so everything is geared towards war. So if anybody thinks that some ideas about how to get to peace can be done via talking nicely or trying to convince butchering Kremlins that that's the best way ahead, that's not going to work. So that's why we support what the US administration has called strength, peace through strength, which means that we have to be very serious as NATO about our own security. So it's national level funding, then it's NATO's collective defense, so as the alliance, and this is where all the allies come in with their defense funding, and that's what we are looking for in the summit, because that involves defense plans that have to be both funded, that involves capabilities that have to be produced and acquired, that involves the new force structures that NATO as a political military alliance has, which means it has to be filled and it has to be exercised. So there is a whole set, and that does require quite a bit of funding. So 3.5% of GDP for purely what complies with NATO's definition of defense in funding is something that is required. But then also that strength means few other things. It means weakening Russia, which in our view is the cheapest way to both achieve peace in Europe, but also to make sure that our security as NATO, as a collective alliance, is strengthened. And that means denying Russia income in budget. So oil, gas, other natural resources exports would be the easiest way, limiting those. But then also continuing to support Ukraine, because Ukraine and strong military, strong country, the ability to defend herself is a deterrent for the whole Euro-Atlantic community against Russia. So that would give a sort of good chance for peace through strength in the whole Euro-Atlantic and beyond. And so NATO summit in that respect is one step to it.
Quickly then on that, we began this year with a lot of talk about a potential ceasefire, about maybe an end to the war this year in Ukraine. The White House seems to have slightly lost interest in that. What's your understanding of that? Do you think there is a chance of ending the war this year, or is that, as far as you can tell, simply not going to happen?
I think there's a good chance. It does require some strong political steps. U.S. sanction package by Lindsey Graham Blumenthal is something that we would strongly support. EU's own strengthening of EU's own sanctions. We saw also countries elsewhere. Australia has just imposed a strong package. Canada. So there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done. And that also concerns so-called third countries, countries in the Gulf and few others, where there are actors who, through services, try to facilitate normalcy by Russian actors, meaning businesses and so on and so forth. So there are partnership elements anywhere, whether that's Far East, whether that's Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, or whether that's the Gulf and other.
So just to be clear, I mean, you think that, I mean, there's the Istanbul talks on and off between Russia and Ukraine. You seem to think there is a chance of ending the war this year, because you also seem to be saying that, you know, Russia is completely geared towards war. Do you gauge that there is an appetite to end the war this year on, I suppose, on the Russian side as well as on the Western side?
The realities are that Russia's economy is not doing well. Again, the military production part comes at the expense of civilian economy. So shortage of labor, lack of growth, more than 1 million soldiers that have been killed and severely wounded. So that doesn't think, and there are many, many thousands who are in exile, you know, some of the best and brightest. It doesn't get well for longevity or sustainability of the economy. But the crucial part is, of course, consciously going after those incomes and technologies that Russia gets to wage the war. So going after the income in the budget, again, oil, gas exports, fertilizers, others, that's a third of the federal budget. So that's where low-hanging fruit lies. But there are also other possibilities, and secondary sanctions by the US and by the EU is another way that would discourage actors to enable the war. Obviously, on technology side, China is the biggest enabler of Russia's war because it supplies to Russia. While they are not military supplies, there is everything else going into Russia, which again allows Russia to cannibalize that and use it for its missiles and other part of the military technology. So there are various, again, opportunities for us as a community, not only Europe, the US, Canada, and elsewhere, but also for the other countries to work on. Right. And I have met quite a number of ministers in my year as minister. Ministers for Africa, ministers from Asia, ministers from South America, and many others. And while they not necessarily impose sanctions on Russia or why they not necessarily provide military equipment to Russia. They all clearly understand that what Russia is doing in Ukraine, bombing civilians, killing children, so on and so forth, is completely unacceptable. And no country in the world wants to be invaded by its neighbor. No country in the world. So, again, for wider global communities, that's quite clear that they do have a pretty realistic view at the situation in Europe and understand the implications and consequences from this.
Can I just ask you? You started off. You said that there are ingredients to this, to ending the war, but also to security. And there's supporting Ukraine. There's strengthening NATO and defense spending, and there's also not thinking that you can persuade the Russians to stop by just speaking nicely to them. It sounds to me like all of those were addressed in one direction, if I may say so, and perhaps towards, to be blunt, towards Donald Trump and the White House. I know it's a tricky question for allied governments because you don't want to kind of publicly antagonize the White House, and yet there is this rift, right? G7 was talking about a big new sanctions package on Russia, and we were kind of led to believe that the Americans would give some new sanctions as well. We didn't see that in the final communique. Donald Trump left. I mean, you get what I'm driving at, really. How do you manage this phenomenon of an America that seems much more kind of sympathetic and open to Moscow?
Listen, our knowledge of Russia and our sort of understanding of Russia is very deep and evidence-based and so on and so forth. So we have pretty clear views on what needs to be done. But in the same time, we fully support the quest for peace and the approach that President Trump had to be quite open to Russia and say, okay, there is a way out of it. There is a way to peace. And if you don't cooperate, then there will be other things happening. So that is the approach that is very understandable. And then within that, our relationship with the US is quite perfect. We have always had, both at the country level, but also community level, we have big communities as the Baltic states in the US and quite a bit of dual American Latvian citizens here. Within that, also our full support to the President Trump is on, for example, defense spending and strengthening NATO. Defense spending not only within the Euro-Atlantic community, so not within the NATO only, but also with regard to the Indo-Pacific region and others, because we really accept that, yes, there is a deep concern about China's development, about the vector and trajectory of China increasing defense spending, the rapid rise in all capabilities, whether it's nuclear or conventional, space, and so on and so forth. So that point that both allies but also partners elsewhere in the world have to be very serious on raising defense spending and gaining capabilities to actually have a proper deterrence, because US alone is not going to be able to provide for that, is quite clear. It's quite clear. And the big game changer in this is indeed China. If it was Russia, Russia is the economy of size of Netherlands. It's probably now below that level.
So your message to the Americans would be China is a part of this whole...
Not only to the Americans, also to our European allies, is that the situation is very serious. That threat both from Russia and the challenge from China are real. And within that, there are other actors. It's not just about, two countries we see, as we started the conversation from the Middle East, how the situation has developed there. But again, there are also sort of lessons to take away from Iran's situation militarily, because we see how weapon systems are performing in both how Israel took out already before the air defense systems and how it's happening now.
Baiba, thank you. Your staff are harassing me and telling me you've got another appointment. I don't know if I may. Listen, I really wanted to get your assessment on what the threat is. Latvia is sitting there along with your neighbors, kind of right next to Russia. The timeline of the threat from Russia. So we've had, we just had a strategic defense review in Britain that was timed for like a decade. We've got to be ready for a Russian attack on NATO in a decade. Mark Rutte said in 5 years, head of the German army saying in 2 years. What is the view from Latvia about the danger of Russia reconstituting and potentially making a move against a NATO country or possibly against the Baltic state?
Again, there is no direct military threat currently against any of NATO nations. And the countries on Russia borders, the allies who we have from Norway to Finland to the Baltic states, Poland, down to the Black Sea allies are united on that. There is no direct military threat. Russians are tied up by Ukraine, in Ukraine. They wouldn't be able to do anything against NATO because that would be a totally different type of war. But in the same time, we take seriously various projections. We analyze, we assess also what Russia is doing below conventional warfare, because Russia's warfare doctrine is one. It involves conventional warfare and non-conventional, sub-conventional warfare. In Ukraine, we are seeing both, but sub-conventional started long before conventional attacks in Ukraine. Then in Europe and also in other places, Russia is conducting sub-conventional warfare. And that relates to cyber, that relates to information, hostile attacks in information space, that relates to various efforts to gain influence within political, economic, media and other spaces. And that is the way Russia has operated. It currently obviously adjusts. But that's the way Soviet Union operated. It's gaining influence at the highest possible level through various means, whether that's corruption, whether that's hack and leak and compromise, or whether that's anything else. And that is happening. To that, we add sabotage in EU countries, or also we saw there were killings, remember Skripal in Britain. We can add also a variety of technological challenges. We saw satellite connections tested and challenged. That is all happening. And that is, of course, with a very practical objective to test, assess, are we ready? Are NATO countries ready for various scenarios? Are we strong enough? Our assessment is that as stronger we are, as less chance for any type of provocations by Russia militarily. So pretty straightforward. And there, within that context, that's why there is no assessment of the date of Russia's reconstitution. Let's remember that in 2021, there were several times more soldiers in our borders on the Russian side, up from Finland down to the Black Sea. There was a Russian navy in the Black Sea. Now it has all moved to the Russian side. It's not anymore near NATO's waters or near Ukrainian waters. So it's further away. So there's, again, that perspective that we have to be strong ourselves. We have to be ready. We have to take security and defense seriously. And defense, it's external defense, but security is very much internal. So we have to pull all the resources together to understand, assess, and counteract. But also we have to be quite clear that Russia is vulnerable. So going after Russian vulnerabilities, as I said, and it's denying income, denying technology and friendships is the way to proceed. And that will make us more secure, more safe. It will increase our deterrence, and it will also bring peace much sooner. So yes, peace within this year is possible, but it requires a whole set of actions. It requires us being strong, it requires weakening Russia, and it requires continuing supporting Ukraine's self-defense.
Baiba, Braže, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate your patience.
Well, thank you very much, Roland, and thank you to the listeners Jonas from Denmark, Debbie from Canada, and Didzis from Latvia, whose questions were picked to be answered in our newsletter this week. Jonas asks, apart from an acceleration of production capacity, to which extent is the recent increase in Russian attacks on civilians A, a symptom of impunity, B, an exploitation of the world's attention shifting, and C, the Russian war strategy being largely ineffective? Dom will answer that question in the newsletter tomorrow, as well as Debbie's I would like to know why all the EU countries and NATO can't make up for what the US sends. I just don't understand how Russia has more weapons than all of us together. He'll also ask Didzy's question. Not ask. I mean, he might ask some questions as well, knowing Dom. But anyway, Didzy's question. Is there a chance that soldiers from Jeff could be deployed as boots on the ground in Ukraine to fight alongside the Ukrainian army now? Because it is my understanding it is a different force than NATO and thus can operate independently. So some great questions. If you want to hear the answers to them, as I say, sign up to our newsletter and we'll link to that in the show notes as we always do. Totally free for everyone. I will be reflecting more on Rutte's strategy for my section in its short-term success, but its long-term risks. And you know me, I might also weave in some historical parallels as well. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.